Let's take a look at a game played between two of my students this last week in Worcester. The game took place on Thursday, and Lou had the white pieces, while the black ones were in the hands of Mike, who was featured in an earlier video. Lou is rated about 1400 or a little bit higher, and struggles a little bit with strategy, but is pretty good at tactics, at least better than the opponents he usually plays against. While Mike is kind of the other way around. He struggles with tactics, but is, in my opinion, very good at strategy. And so the games between these two players tend to show you what happens when a good strategic player runs up against a good tactical player. Lou opened with d4, and this is what Lou does 100% of the time as far as I know. He's a Stonewall player, so he likes to put pawns on d4, e3, and f4, and c3, and create a very solid dark square pawn chain that's difficult for black to break down. Mike played knight f6, Lou played e3, and Mike played d5. Now, Mike and I have talked in the past about how Lou is a Stonewall player and how exactly to play against that. And what's normal for white in this position is to play the move bishop to d3. And that's because if you're going to create a pawn chain that looks like this, it's not too difficult to understand that your best minor piece is going to be a minor piece that fits well with that structure. It's going to be the light squared bishop, which from d3 is controlling the a2 h7 diagonal. Whereas your worst minor piece is going to be the bishop on c1, which doesn't have much of a future. So normal for white is to play bishop d3 here, trying to get that move in before black plays bishop f5. If white doesn't do that, and black plays bishop f5, and white goes for a Stonewall structure anyway, then white's not even going to have a nice bishop on d3, and should it ever show up there, black can simply trade it off with his bishop from f5. So after d5, Lou played knight d2, which is not a good move, because it does not take over this diagonal. And I think if I were Mike, I would have immediately played bishop to f5, and in fact that's what the two of us have talked about in the past. But he decided to do something else. He played c5, which is a fine move, and I think still gets white into trouble. Black is developing a big pawn center, whereas white is playing more passively. So if white's not careful, it's not going to be very many more moves before black has more than made up for white's starting move, which means we could see within a few moves a position in which black is better. Lou played c3 to defend his center, and this is extremely solid and is consistent with his idea to play a Stonewall, but is a little bit passive for white. This structure is used a lot by black. Black will put a pawn on c6, a pawn on d5, and a pawn on e6. It's called the triangle setup, or is sometimes played as part of the semi-Slav defense. It's very solid, but it's not particularly ambitious. So I don't think it's all that great an idea to use when you have the white pieces. And black can try to take advantage of this by being really ambitious in the center and trying to come out with an advantage very early in the game. Mike played knight c6, and Lou played bishop to d3 finally. But if we go back a few moves, we would have gotten to this position likely anyway if Lou had played bishop d3, and after c5, c3, and then after knight c6 had made the mistake of playing knight d2. And the reason this is a good position for black is that here black can play the really ambitious, really good move, e7 to e5. And it's not that hard to tell that black's pawn center is much bigger than white's, right? Black has 3 pawns on the 4th rank from his point of view, whereas white only has 1. So black has significantly more central space here. And it's because white, as I said earlier, because white has played as passively as he has, that black can get away with something like this. And in their games in the past, because this position has arisen at least once between these two players, Lou played knight takes e5, and Mike responded with Lou played d takes e5, Mike responded with knight takes e5, and the game went on from here. Lou decided to try something different this time, which is to play bishop to b5, moving his light-squared bishop for a second time. And again, in my opinion, not a very good move. White is the first player, he gets the first move, he should be the one coming out of the opening with an advantage. But what we're already seeing is that after White has made his extra move, he has the same number of developed pieces as Black, and significantly less space in the center. So White has not done a great job in the opening, and Black is already better. I want to go back for a second to talk about a slightly better way to get into the stonewall structure if that's what you want to do with White. First of all, if you get into this variation with, no, let's go back a sec. Instead of knight d2, after bishop to d3, Black can still play c5, c3, knight c6, and he's threatening to play the move e5. So you don't want to play knight d2 here with White, but you can play f4 as a way of securing the e5 square so Black can't play e5, and then you can go ahead with your normal stonewall moves. Now, I don't think this opening works out very well for White. In fact, after the move bishop to g4, knight f3, e6, for example, knight bd2, bishop d6, castle kingside, Black's already got a very good move in c takes d4. And the reason this is strong is that White would love to recapture with the e-pawn, hoping to bring his bishop on c1 to life. But if he does that here, he does it as a pawn sacrifice, because the pawn on f4 is undefended. And if he takes back with the c-pawn, then this bishop on c1 remains a problem, and Black, after castling, very quickly will put a rook on c8, and will be threatening to put a knight on b4, and then to bring some piece into c2, or to trade off this valuable minor piece on d3. But getting back to the game, Lou played bishop to v5, and Mike played bishop d6. Yeah, I suppose you could try capturing on d4. I think the computer likes e takes d4 followed by c takes d4 and then playing bishop d6. It thinks it's more advantageous that way. I'm not really sure why, and I love Mike's decision to just bring another piece out. His pawn on e5 was under-defended because the bishop on b5 was pinning the knight to the king. So d takes e5 maybe was being threatened by White, so Black deals with that problem by bringing out another minor piece. And it's clear now that Black has a development lead in addition to his space advantage in the center. Lou played d takes e5, bishop takes e5, and now the move f4. And this brings up something important about moving your f-pawn. The movement of the f-pawn to f4 is okay in the stonewall structure because it's so solid in the center. But when White doesn't have a d-pawn, this move f4 tends to be really bad. And that's because once Mike retreats his bishop, gets away from the one-move threat to capture his piece, he now has what I was referring to in the last game I showed you as a mobile pawn center. In addition to that, he has simply more space in the center. These c5 and d5 pawns provide more space than do the c3, e3, and f4 pawns for White. So for the rest of, well, for the foreseeable future anyway, White's going to have to calculate on every move what happens if Black plays d4 and what happens if Black plays c4. And these are both reasonable looking moves because d4 makes the center explode when Black's king is closer to being castled than White's. And the move c4 secures the d3 square as an outpost for a Black minor piece. So they're both moves that have to be calculated, and either one could turn out to be an excellent move for Black at any time. In addition, without a d-pawn here, and that with it having been traded for Black's e-pawn, this White e3 pawn is now backwards on a half-open file, and therefore is a target for the Black pieces. Lou played knight g to f3, Black castled kingside, continuing to spend each move bringing out a new piece or making a central pawn move or getting the king to safety. So far, this game is being played very well by Black and not very well by White. White castled, and Black played rook e8, going after this target on e3 and securing the e4 square, which is an outpost for the black pieces. Queen c2 from white. You know, and this is actually not that bad a move, given the predicament white is in right now. This bishop on c1 is a very bad piece, and if this pawn structure remains in place, it will continue to be a very bad piece. So the move queen c2, which sacrifices the pawn on e3, is actually not the end of the world. It loses a pawn. I think it's clearly a good idea for black to take it, which Mike did. But this bishop now has slightly more life than it did before, and if white someday plays the move f4, f5, the bishop may be able to help in some way with a kingside attack. Lou played knight g5, which lines up the knight in coordination with the queen on c2 in an attack on h7. And Lou's idea, as he explained to me, is to move this knight out of the way toward the king side, including that knight in the attack as well, which is done with tempo because he's revealing an attack on the rook on e3. Mike played rook back to e8, just getting the rook out of danger. I like this move. White played knight d to f3, and now h6 from black. Okay, so I usually stress with my students that making pawn moves in front of your king when you're defending against an attack is something you should only do if it's absolutely necessary for some tactical reason. And that's because these pawn moves tend to create weaknesses that your opponent can try to exploit while he's attacking you. So this move h6 normally would not be a good move, because even though it comes with tempo and gets this knight on g5 to step out of the way, when white eventually plays f5, the white dark squared bishop might enter the game by sacrificing itself on h6, which might open up the black king and lead somehow to white winning the game. Here, though, I think it's a good move. And that's because in this particular situation, the knight on g5 does not have any good squares to go to. Can't use h7 or f7 or e6, though you should always calculate this move knight takes f7 when black has played h6, because the light squares around the black king are weak in that case. But it doesn't seem to lead to anything here. Knight e4 is not an option, and obviously the knight can't step back on top of the other knight on f3. So if white wants to hold on to the piece, he has to play knight h3. And there's one black minor piece which has not moved yet. That's the light squared bishop on c8. And there's a knight on h3, which if captured would leave behind it a pawn that would, I think, much rather be on g2 than h3. So if I were Mike, I would probably have captured on h3, destroying the white kingside pawn structure, leaving white with 3 isolated pawns. And yeah, that it's somewhat double-edged, because white can try to use the g-file to attack the black king, but I can only imagine that that what black gets out of this is much more, it's worth much more than what he gives up. Mike chose the move queen b6 instead, though, and this activates the queen and puts it on a diagonal that it shares with the white king. It also hits this undefended bishop on b5, and if white wants to include this bishop on b5 in the attack on black's king, the natural way to do that is to stick it on the b1 h7 diagonal. But if white does that here, black would win a piece with c4 check. So that was probably Mike's idea. Lou instead played a4, and Mike played a6, putting the question to that bishop. And there isn't really anywhere good for the bishop to go. As I said, bishop d3 would not be a good idea. So if white wants to hold on to this bishop, he has to stick it on the e2 square. But on e2, it's not doing very much, and it's blocking white's potential control of the e-file. So Lou, I think correctly, decides to trade on c6. Mike took back with the b-pawn. My inclination would have been to take back with the queen, preserving black's queenside pawn structure. So I'm curious why Mike chose b takes c6, but he did. B takes c6, probably to keep this queen on the same diagonal as the king, which might reap some kind of tactical benefit in the near future. Lou played queen f2, breaking the attack, the indirect attack by the black queen on the white king. And now Mike decided to trade on h3. So he did it. He just wanted to insert this maneuver with the black queen to the queen side first, and that's fine. G takes h3, White's kingside pawn structure is now shattered. And black is up that pawn he grabbed on the e3 square. So black's up a pawn. White's kingside pawn structure is destroyed. Black's king is safer than white's. And black's pieces are better than white's. This bishop on d6 is clearly a better piece than the bishop on c1, and the rook on e8, clearly a better piece than the rook on f1. Mike played knight e4, adding a piece to the list of pieces which have better squares than their counterparts in the white army. This knight on e4 is better than the knight on f3. Queen g2 and f5. Okay, so this is a little bit dangerous, but I think I understand Mike's idea. He sees that this bishop on c1 is a bad piece as long as white's pawns on b2, c3, and f4 remain where they are. So he figures, since it's a natural idea for white to play f5 when he'll be threatening bishop takes h6, which would bring the dark squared bishop into the game, he should stop f5 and keep this bishop on c1 a bad piece by playing f5 himself. The downside is that it weakens further the kingside light squares for black. So white may show up with some piece on g6 at some point with an impact that black doesn't like very much. White played knight h4. Mike threw in c4 check. Reasonable move. I mean, you can either play this or not play it. I think it's a good move because it secures the d3 square as another outpost for this black knight should it ever need a different one. And it allows black to have more control of this diagonal so that at some point in the future he might get in, let's say, knight f2 check, which might win the game tactically. White played king h1, and already here we can see that if white threatens checkmate with rook g1, oops, sorry, black played rook f8 to guard his f5 pawn that he was being threatened by the knight. We can see already here that if rook g1, which threatens checkmate, black wins the game immediately with knight f2 check, forcing the win of the white queen, as the white king has nowhere to go. So Lou played rook f3. An interesting move. It continues to guard the f2 square, and it has the idea that white's going to either bring this bad bishop into the game on e3, or trade it off for black's dark squared bishop. I like that move. Mike played rook a to e8, including his last piece in the game. And I think up to this point we can say that black clearly has been outplaying white. Black has been showing superior knowledge of chess strategy and has at this point, I don't know for sure, but what I can only imagine is evaluated by a computer as a winning position. All of the black pieces are active and many of the white ones are not. White has an attack going with his queen on g2 and his knight on h4, but that's not very much. And this bishop on c1 and the rook on a1 and the rook on f3 are not very good pieces. In addition, black is still up a pawn. So bishop e3 from white, good move, activating the bishop, taking over this diagonal, and Mike decides to respond with bishop c5, trading the bishops off, and I think that's a good idea. Normally, you wouldn't want to trade a good bishop for a bad bishop, but an exception occurs when not trading them off will leave your opponent's piece better than yours. And I think here, if black just moves the queen away, this bishop on e3 is significantly better than it was a second ago, and might even show up on d4 and help with an attack on g7. So I like the decision to play bishop c5. White plays bishop takes c5. And Mike decides to play knight takes c5 instead of queen takes. My first inclination, of course, is to play queen takes c5, continuing to put pressure on the f2 square. So again, here, rook g3 is probably not a very good move. Knight f2 check would hurt white. But Mike may have been worried that in this position, after, let's say, rook g1, threatening checkmate on g7, it's kind of difficult to defend that pawn. If black plays rook to e7, knight g6 will fork the rook on f8 and the rook on e7. The same thing will happen after queen e7. Knight g6 will fork the rook on f8 and the queen on e7. And if the rook on f8 goes to f7 to defend g7, then it's overloaded and is no longer defending the f5 pawn, and white can play knight takes f5. And if black plays queen a7 to defend g7, then when white invades, let's say queen g6 here, he's threatening knight takes f5, and queen takes h6, and queen takes c6. And this looks pretty intimidating. So I think I can understand why Mike took back on c5 with the knight. Lou played rook to g1, and he's now threatening checkmate on g7. Obviously, black has to defend against that. And Mike chose to defend against it with a move whose tactical evaluation is very bad for black. He played knight to e6. At this point, I think he had to defend with the queen. For example, with queen c7, which puts some pressure on f4, and the queen may combine with the knight at some point to grab that pawn. And now if the white queen shows up on g6, black can kick it away with rook e6, and has not lost his protection of g7, and is in the process protecting h6, which the white queen was threatening to capture. But Mike defended with knight to e6. And now after queen g6, white has tactical threats that are really hard for black to deal with. He's threatening queen takes h6 and knight takes f5. Mike played queen d8, and Lou can either take the f-pawn here or the h-pawn. He chose to take on h6 with his queen, which turns out to allow some counterplay for black. It's very hard to see. But black can play the move d4 here. And the idea is that after queen d5, the rook on f3 will be pinned to the king, and when this rook shows up on f6, scaring the queen away from h6, the queen will not be able to sit on either g5 or h6, which are the two squares she can use to defend f4, at which point the f-pawn will be hanging and black can take it. That's pretty complicated, so I don't blame Mike for not seeing it. Whoops. Okay, so for knight e6, queen g6, queen d8, Lou captured this pawn on h6, and Mike played rook to f6. I've got to promote this. There we go. Rook f6, scaring the queen on h6 away. Very good. Fine. Queen h5. And now, unfortunately, Mike blundered with the move rook to h6, threatening the queen, and with the idea probably that the knight may be vulnerable on h4 behind it. But unfortunately, the reason the queen could sit on h6 on the previous move is the reason she can go back there on this move. Queen takes h6 just wins a rook because the pawn on g7 is pinned to the black king. And Mike resigned here. Okay, so I think this game demonstrates something really important, which is that though strategy is extremely important, and though Mike is a very good strategic player, what a lot of these games come down to is tactics. Mike completely outplayed Lou and had, for a while, a totally winning position. But then one or two bad moves tactically cost him an entire rook, and at that point he had a losing position. And this is why it's so important if you're, especially, let's say the lower rated you are, the more important it is that you spend time studying tactics rather than strategy. You can have all the strategic knowledge in the world, but if at the end of your strategic brilliance you hang a queen, it doesn't matter. Okay, hope you enjoyed the video, and I, of course, will be back with more in the future. Thanks.